Now I want to briefly introduce to you Mori Ogai. Two different pictures you see here. His years 1862 to 1922. You're going to be reading his short story The Dancing Girl, a work that was published in a widely read newspaper slash magazine of the time called Kokumi no Tomo, which means the people's friend. Mori Ogai is usually considered, along with Natsume Soseki, whose novel you'll be reading next, as one of the two major figures in Meiji letters and intellectual life, which is to say, right at the end of Meiji, which is the beginning of the 20th century, he's one of the towering figures that Japanese thought about as they conceived of themselves in the world and as they conceived of the way that of themselves within art and literature and society, within Japanese society as well as world society. Soseki and Ogai are very different writers with contrasting concerns who, taken together, provide real insight into what it was like to be a Meiji man, what it meant to be like to be a man at the turn of the 20th century in Japan, and thereby what it meant to be a Japanese man as well as a person thinking about Japan in the world in a radically, rapidly changing, globalized context. Natsume Soseki, who we read next, can be said to be most taken with issues of humanity and humanistic ideals, with issues of the individual and identity, while Ogai tends to be serene, and he displays, especially in the works later in his life, a real deep respect for Japanese tradition. Soseki is a typical literary figure in that most of his life was spent at a distance from the government and societal elite. Ogai, however, served as a high-ranking government official all of his life. Right, he was part of the government in a way that Soseki was very much not a part of the establishment. Ogai grew up in a samurai household of some prestige. His father was a doctor, and Ogai himself would go on to be a high-ranking military doctor, equivalent of the Surgeon General. Soseki was proud of his traditional Tokugawa roots. Soseki would go on to study in England. Ogai studied medicine in Germany. Like Soseki, Ogai was sent to study abroad on a government scholarship. The difference, however, is that in contrast to Soseki's experience, Soseki had a terrible time in London. Ogai seems to have had a very positive and very enriching time in Germany and in Europe. He made many friends. He was able to participate in the intellectual life of Germany as well, and you get some picture of from the story of the way that someone like Ogai might have felt comfortable within German society. Ogai, who, like Soseki in many of his time, would return from the overseas experience with serious doubts about the wisdom of a headlong push to emulate and imitate Western modes in politics and culture. Right, there was a real craze for Western, democratic, egalitarian, capitalist, imperialist European, especially American ways of doing things in the early 20th century. The men like Ogai and Soseki who went to these places, in point of fact, who came back, had serious doubts about this and were quite concerned about what was being lost, and less concerned and less enthusiastic about what might be gained. And so while their points of concern are quite different one from the other, they both introduced to the Japanese society and culture of the time discussions, and they introduce a critical voice that are concerning the role and the place and the speed of modernization of Japan at the time. Ogai is especially known as a conduit for European literature. He read widely in European literary trends, and it greatly influenced his own reading and writing, his writing in particular, and so at this stage as well he has a profound impact on the sort of writing and the way that the arts were produced in Japan. He was an accomplished translator of poetry and also of prose, especially from German to Japanese. His contributions to the intellectual life of the Meiji era are enormous. His translations are stylistically important because of the difficulty in finding a proper literary style at the time, and I could go into a complicated discussion of this, but suffice it to say that how to write, given the way that Japanese language is stratified to different status levels, figuring how to write to a general populace was a major issue to be solved, and Ogai is widely credited with being one of the early people to actually do this. For example, the writing of Higuchi Ichio, who you also read for this module, does not accomplish this, is very, for all its profound accomplishment, for all the great writing that she did, it does reflect an old hierarchical style where you are either being talked to, talked up to, or talked down to as a reader of the work. Ogai helped figure out this literary style, but also introduced a variety of ideas in literature that his translations brought to the general populace of Japan. His translations encouraged many Japanese to read the major European, especially German philosophers and thinkers, and the German influence on philosophy and writing and thinking has been very strong in Japan ever since. And Ogai may be one of the places we can look to for the strength of that tradition. Ogai is noted for his contribution to the written style, as I mentioned. His experiments with Western-style theater were also important to the development of drama within Japan. He is known throughout his life as a first-rate thinker and translator. To call him a novelist is something that comes to him after his death, really. He provides something of a touchstone for many later intellectuals, because often, whenever people talk about later generations of Japanese who go to live overseas, invariably the comparisons are to Ogai and his experience overseas, both the manner that he lived as a writer as well as a person, a Japanese person, through the experience of living overseas. Right? He was a high-ranking government official. At the same time, he was very much an iconoclast and a radical all through his life. He had a distinguished political career. He was Surgeon General in the Army for many years, a position that one would think politically to be very conservative, and indeed it was. At the same time, he was very provocative and entertained many forward-thinking but hard to accept at the time ideas. His personal life, his biography, the outline of his personal life fits the prototype of Meiji development. He's the precocious youth who is able to seize the opportunity to study abroad. The European experience gives him the authority to be greatly involved in determining the future of his country. He shares the common Meiji aspiration to master the secrets of Western traditions, but he's one of the few who are able to actually do so. For all that, the hermetic life, this single-minded devotion often demands. We also know that he was human enough to become involved with a woman in Germany, for example, which leads many to extrapolate on the ways that The Dancing Girl is indeed autobiographical. This work, The Dancing Girl, is often cited as the first great piece of modern short fiction writing in Japan. It's modern in its frank psychology, right? If we think about what motivates this narrator and the people he's with, what his foibles are, what paralyzes him in a psychological way, there's much that seems Freudian and psychological about the unconscious and the subconscious and other forces that work on him. He's also known for his skillful observation and his depiction of human foibles, but his style is decidedly classical, and this is something that's not going to be represented in the translation. So for all his work in figuring out a way to write contemporary Japanese, as I mentioned, his Japanese writing, feels much more classical, much more ancient that way. And then this is one way he does share with Higuchi Ichio, right? And also with Higuchi Ichio, these complicated characters he can provide. It would be Natsume Soseki, whose novel you read next, that those of you who are taking Japanese language will be able to figure out. Ogai is impossible to read in many ways. Natsume Soseki reads like a modern novelist, and so there's an important difference, an important moment marked here in these styles of writing. The story, Dancing Girl in English translation, deals with the ambiguous nature of duty, which is a very old theme from samurai tales, and when one is forced to choose between loyalty to one's lord or loyalty to one's family or the love of a woman that one loves, right? So this is an old storyline in Japan. Do you do the dutiful thing and serve your master, which is not now a samurai master, but a government post, to bring prestige to your family, or does one remain loyal to the woman that one has fallen in love with? In this story, it's Meiji society that forms the backdrop for such issues, and it may be less a love story than the story of a man coming to terms with his weaknesses, as many of you will also think. But he keeps saying yes to everything, but he cannot have everything, and he this story has outlined for many in Japan the contradictions, the conflicts, the difficulties of living in a modern world.